All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this Monday for the Mobility Monday. We are very excited to have two fantastic guests to share a little bit of history and inside scoop, if you will, about the orientation and mobility profession. This is an OMSA meeting. We're delighted to have you all. And I'm excited to welcome Bill Wiener and Eileen Sifferman. Eileen has planned some questions to ask Bill to get to the bottom of some of these historic events and learn a little bit more. So thank you two for being here tonight, and we're excited to learn.
Good. Thank
Pleasure to
you.
be here.
I'm going to start by, sort of talking a little bit about what a profession is, and we're going to talk about the foundations of the profession for orientation and mobility. And we have several models of other professions that over the years we have looked at when we have been developing some of our standards. But behind all the facts and the things that are posted in or written in our chapter on the foundation of the development of the profession of orientation mobility, there are a lot of backstories. Not all the backstories I know, because Bill came into the profession earlier than I did. He's younger than I am, but he came into the profession earlier than I did. So I always have some questions myself regarding about how did we get to where we were when this happened. So I have shared my questions with Bill, and so I'm sure he will have some good stories to tell us. So my first question is, after the initiation of the university preparation programs began in the early 60s, what led to the discussion of the setting of standards for those preparation programs?
All right. Well, first, I have to say that as old as I am, I'm not really didn't start at the very beginning of the profession. I was chair of the division at a time when the archives were actually in a box and were handed from one chair to the next chair. And Bob Whitstock handed it to Bob Krause, and Bob Krause handed it to me. And so I had access to a lot of that early information. And I actually started teaching before I had a degree in O&M, and that was in 1967. So the very, very early years, I know something about it because I worked with the people who were involved in it, and I had access to all of the information as chair of the Division 9 of AER early on. So let me begin with a little bit that occurred before I started, and then kind of share with you what happened as I got more involved in it. And, I think we know that the first meeting that ever took place of orientation and mobility specialists was in New York City at an AAWB meeting in 1964. And Rod Cossack called all the mobility specialists together who were at that meeting, and there were only about 16 people. And they came together and they decided that they wanted to form some kind of an association. And really, this led to certification, and certification led to the process of standards for the university programs. And we had a number of university programs that started. We had in 1960 Boston College. In 1961, we had Western Michigan University. In 66, we had San Francisco State, we had Florida, University of Florida, and they all had basically very similar kinds of curriculum. And I can tell you this, that when I was at Western Michigan as the chair of the department there, the dean of the graduate school was George Mallinson. And I got to get pretty close with him. And one day I asked him, how did you come to have the particular courses that you have at Western? And he said to me, that was really easy. He said, what we did was we looked at what Heinz had and we slapped numbers on what they were doing.
Hmm.
And so, it was dynamics of blindness, it was techniques, it was sensory involvement, it was diseases of the eye, it was other physical disabilities. All of those seminars that they had, they changed them and put course numbers on them. And that's how Western started its program. And of course, the other universities had a lot of the early pioneers that came from Heinz. And similarly, I'm sure that they put their courses together pretty much in the same way.
So,
And
Phil, let me interrupt you then. Why didn't we follow the medical model and continue that idea?
that's a good question. And I remember talking with Stanley Saturco about that at one point in time, who was a professor at Western Michigan. And he said, we had the option of following the medical model, but we decided we didn't want to work under the direction of physicians. And so we gave that up. Personally, as I think back upon it, I'm not so sure that was the greatest idea in the world, but that was what followed. And so we had these universities, not many of them, and certification had evolved, and we'll get more into certification in a while, I guess. But after certification evolved, the question was, what are we going to do when new universities come online? And in 1972, we had 3 new undergraduate universities that evolved. I think it was Talladega, Stephen F. Austin, and Cleveland State University. And so they wanted to see, was the curricula appropriate? Could these people be certified? And they began looking at the curricula and they said, well, we don't have any standards for undergraduate curricula, but you know what? We don't have any standards for the graduate curriculum as well. We don't have any of that. And so, the idea, I think, was that we needed to do something to develop curriculum. And
Let me interrupt
yeah.
again. Sorry. Was there any recognition that other professionals like OTPT, audiology, which you have a background in, that they required for applicants for certification to come from an accredited university?
Well, we knew that was the case, but we were so far from that point. I mean, we started with so few individuals, and we were flying by the seat of our pants, so to speak. We really needed some kind of professional organization. I mean, as you said, that's the basis of the development of professionalism as our associations. But we didn't get to that point that early on. But what eventually happened was this: we had to find some way of evaluating the universities. And so a committee was formed, and the committee began looking at what is the curricula, what should the curricula be like? And I was at that point in time involved in that effort. I was on that committee, actually I was chairing that committee. And what we did was we looked at each of the university programs, we looked at what they were offering. We looked at other professions at that point, and we saw what faculty guidelines were like. We looked at what their mechanisms of certification were like as well. And there were others who had done some work on this previously. Butch Hill, who was a good friend of mine, had done some work on trying to put together that kind of information. And he had a start on that. And he helped us put all of that together. And so we put this proposal together and we presented it, and it talked about a number of different areas. It talked about what should the qualifications be for faculty, what content should be present, how should we review universities, this kind of thing. And then we proposed that in 1977 in Portland, Oregon, at one of the AAWB meetings. And there was a lot of discussion about it, and especially about how many faculty there should be. There were programs that had one faculty member. Was that sufficient? There were programs that had, or thinking about putting, that were thinking of coming together with maybe a part-time faculty member. Would that be sufficient? There was so much discussion that they decided at that point in time that we weren't ready to put those criteria together yet. And so the committee was asked to gather further information, come back at the next meeting, which would be 2 years later, with a revised proposal. And we did that. I mean, we talked to people in the field, we talked to the different universities. We revised it. We presented it in 1979, and they said, yes, this is a good, solid basis, for setting these standards, for reviewing these preparation programs. And over the years, there have been committees, that look at this. And of course, now it is out of the hands of the professional organizations. And, it's really an accreditation rather than a program review. So that's how it came to be.
So when did certification sort of then enter into it? Because initially, wasn't it you had to be a graduate from one of the programs in order to be certified? Wasn't that the basis criteria for or eligibility for applying?
Yeah, that was the basis of eligibility. They did have a grandfather clause, however, when it first started. And the grandfather clause, I think, was supposed to be 3 years in length. And then after that, you had to graduate from a university. It could be a graduate university. It could be Florida State University. They mentioned Florida State in particular because that was the only undergraduate university at that point in time. And then, of course, they thought that they would end the grandfather clause, but at that point in time, they had changed the vision requirements. At one point in time, it was 20/20 with really a perfect visual field. And we had changed that. And so we decided, no, we better extend the grandfather clause then, because there were many people that had less vision than that, who should have a chance to be certified. So that's basically what happened. Then it was formed into two types of certification. We had provisional and we had permanent. And the idea was you started with provisional, you moved to permanent. And that was a real problem for us because in the meantime, as professions develop, one of the things that they develop is a code of ethics that guides their practice. And so we had been working on developing a code of ethics that evolved in 1973. And then after that had evolved, we began thinking, well, if we have this code of ethics, we should be able to ask people who are entering the field to adhere to it, to sign on to it, to accept that as the mode of operation. But we began looking at certification, and certification said, you have permanent certification. And how do you enforce certification? The only way you can enforce certification is if you can withdraw certification. Because if people are violating certification or violating the code of ethics, if that's part of certification, then the way that you want to be able to enforce it is by having at least that club that if you are violating it, we could take away your certification. And if you have permanent certification, we thought, you can't do that. It's not possible. And so that caused us to rethink certification and to really move away from provisional and permanent, and to think about going in a different direction where it might be continuous, but based upon continuing education, for example. And I think that's the impetus for making that change.
Yeah, but what was the discussion around those of us who were permanent at that time? We had permanent certification.
Yeah, we had permanent certification. And I think there were people who said at that time, well, I'm not going to give up permanent certification. Why should I give that up? I have that anyway. I'll have it for my lifetime, and I won't have to worry about continuing education, etc. Um, and I think there were people who decided they wouldn't give it up, but the majority of people said, you know, for the benefit of the profession, to do this in the right way, to make sure that everybody's keeping up in the field, learning new information, we should have renewable certification that's based upon continuing ed. And probably, Eileen, you probably know more about that than I do, because as you know, the first chair of ACVREP, first director of ACVREP, you probably faced a lot of that. What did you find?
Well, I go back further than that. When you were chair and president of AER, you appointed me to chair certification review committee. Now, certification review committee was structured out of the Division 9, and it was a committee of Division 9. But at the time that you became president of AER, it was over all the certifications. So in looking at the recertification process, and again, I think we looked to the other professionals of what they were doing so we could equate ourselves with those professionals. And I think we were struggling to get that level of recognition as O&M specialists, as being a professional, because I think the broader community of professionals, even within the area of vision, didn't really consider O&M specialists to be a profession. It was a nice job, but it wasn't considered a profession. So those were the things we were struggling with, and I think why we made some of the changes within, at that time it was AER, of going to a renewable certification requiring continuing education credits. But those who were already permanently certified didn't have to give that up, and until we started ACVREP, where when we transferred over to ACVREP, it was required to give up your permanent certification and do renewable.
And how did you find that? Did
They
you
were
find
not
that?
happy campers.
That's
There
what I
were people
suspected.
who
Yeah.
say, I'm not giving up my AER permanent. And a lot of people existed on that and worked with that certification, even with ACVREP was in existence until AER said we no longer have that certification and did away with it. But there were a few years of overlap that people would not give up their AER permanent certification. I don't think we could go back to using it if we wanted to, but I still have my certificate.
And I think people found that ACVREP certification was legitimate certification. And,
Yes.
you know, that permanent certification was a thing of the past and really not looked upon as being a real credential.
Well, the criteria and standard for certification is that a membership organization cannot grant certification. They can give a recognition or a certificate, which basically was the standard of what we had with AAWB and AER. But with ACVREP, because it was established as a certifying body, that is a certification. Bill, why don't you go back and talk a little bit about what the thinking was with regarding blind mobility instructors and what caused it to change?
Yeah, that is such a long and I think in some ways twisted occurrence in our field. I remember when I first entered, and I was taught as a student that you needed to have 20/20 vision and really good peripheral vision. And I was taught at that point in time that you had to be able to see posture, you had to be able to notice facial expressions, you had to be able to determine if there was a car that might be turning the corner that, you know, may be dangerous. if there was an obstacle that could be a real problem, a drop off, something of that nature. And you needed to be able to do this at distances that were great enough so that you didn't have to be right on top of the person. And I believe that. That's what I was told. I know that Richard Hoover, who was the founder, along with Warren Bledsoe and Russ Williams, that certainly Richard Hoover, who had become an ophthalmologist, this is what he was saying. And I think we all believe that. And I remember my first professional meeting was in Richmond, Virginia in 1971 as a newly minted O&M specialist. And I was sitting there and I heard the chair of the certification review committee, who at that point in time was Bruce Blosh. And Bruce basically said, does it make sense that we continue with a 20/20 visual acuity requirement when people who have 20/40 are driving cars at 60 and 70 and 80 miles an hour and are able to function just fine? And yet we're requiring our instructors who are walking to have perfect vision. And he had proposed that we change the standard to be really 20/40. And I think that was the first time I was exposed to this idea. And it made a lot of sense to me. And I thought, yes, that makes a lot of sense. Well, later on, I became the chair of the certification committee. And it was at a point in time when people who are visually impaired were questioning this. Because if you know the history at all, it was always blind people teaching other blind people to teach people to travel independently. And throughout the ages, they did that. And now all of a sudden, these young upstarts are here and they're saying, no, you can't do this any longer. Only we can do this. And, this was upsetting, but yet there was this idea that you had to have 20/40 vision. Well, we came up with the idea, well, what's magic about 20/40? That may have to do with driving a car, but it doesn't have an awful lot to do with the tasks of orientation and mobility. So at that point in time, we came up with this idea on the certification committee. We decided that we would look into something called the functional abilities checklist. And the idea was this, that rather than having a specific acuity, that we would test individuals who were applying for certification. And that, of course, was certification at that point through AAWB. That what we would do is we would have another instructor evaluate them on certain abilities relating to orientation and mobility. And we had a form, a checklist. And, we would evaluate, could they intervene in enough time? Being maybe several hundred feet away from the student. And if they could do this, we would say they've passed, that checklist and they could be certified. And so we were
Still
slowly
having
drifting.
gone through one of the programs, though.
Yes, having gone through one of the programs. Yeah, absolutely. So we were slowly drifting away from this idea of having to have a certain acuity. And I was one of the individuals who initially had said you have to have a certain acuity to be able to teach orientation and mobility, because you had to be able to know ahead of time so you could intervene. Now, it didn't have to be 20/20, but it had to be enough vision so that you could observe your student from a distance and intervene. But there were so many questions about this and so many blind people that were saying, no, that is not right. We've been doing this for years and we've been doing it well. So I, along with Olga Jaffe at the American Foundation for the Blind, and at that point in time, the American Foundation for the Blind always had a staff member who was a mobility specialist who would advise the foundation about mobility matters. So together, Olga and I went to the Nebraska agency, an adult agency, and we asked them, can we observe you? And we want to see how blind instructors who are working at your facility are teaching blind people to travel. And they said, no, we can't do that. But I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll blindfold you and we'll have you travel and we will show you how we do this. And so we went through this. And it was amazing to me. They were doing things I had never, ever thought of. For example, I always wondered, how would you know if your student was coming to the end of a corner? You know, whether it's a drop off at a curb or a ramp that was built in. What would happen if a person overstepped the curb or went out down the ramp and went into the street? You'd never know that. Well, while we were being taught, our instructors would walk ahead of us, sometimes even walking backwards with their cane behind them rather than in front of them. And when they got to the corner, they would take their cane and they would stretch it out. They would walk into the street slightly, right by the curb or the ramp, and they would stretch their cane out. And if we overstepped, we would hit their cane. And they had all kinds of different innovations that I had never, ever thought about doing. And I came away from that experience thinking, we've been closed-minded on this thing. And I've really been wrong about it. I was one of the people that was adamantly saying you need a certain amount of vision. So what we decided to do was this. We called for a conference, and the American Foundation for the Blind helped us to sponsor it. It was at one of our meetings, and we invited blind instructors from around the country, and we invited mobility instructors from around the country. And we had some good interaction about traveling. And we did this not only in meeting rooms, but we went outside and we did some traveling. And from that, I think we began to realize as a profession that this was something that wasn't requiring vision, that this could be done. But we also realized that not every blind person could teach orientation and mobility, that it had to be a blind person who was so comfortable in traveling independently on his or her own that they didn't have to pay a lot of attention to where they were. They had to be able to monitor the person who they were teaching. So it had to be a very good traveler to begin with who could do this. Not everybody could do it. But that really led us, I think, in the right direction. And at the same time, ADA was unfolding. And the Americans with Disabilities Act said, if a person can't do something because of a disability, you really have to look for reasonable accommodations that will allow them to do the job. And obviously, there were these reasonable accommodations that could be done. And I thought at that point in time that what we needed was some kind of a book that would put together kind of an outline of how to use these various techniques that a blind person might use in teaching orientation and mobility. That was never really put together, but there have been articles since that time that have been around, you know, in different journals. But that would probably be a really good book to have at some point.
Yeah, and then there was the experience that Gayla was also involved in with going, right? Do you remember that? She went out and worked,
Yeah,
and
she
of
did
course,
some.
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
And
She
then
was one.
Nora and Laura have done recently. So
Yeah, they have. They've done quite a bit along those lines. Actually, Bill Jacobson did quite a bit as well early
oh,
on.
yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
And right now, I think our journal, the New Review, is getting ready to publish an article that goes into some, not a lot of detail, but some detail on accommodations that are used. But I think it's something we need a lot more of. And I can understand why the National Federation for the Blind and people who were blind felt that they needed their own university. And you know, that Louisiana Tech was formed. Even though we opened up certification eventually to people with disabilities, you know, feeling discriminated against for a long period of time, Yeah, I think I would want to open a university as well.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and their own certification.
And their own
Uh,
certification,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, mentioned went into talking about literature. One of the um, pillars of a profession is that we have our own literature and body of knowledge, and that was recognized. Why don't you talk a little bit about how the publications of O&M started?
Yeah, well, it was interesting. When I started in the field, there was a magazine, it was called The New Outlook for the Blind. And it was the forerunner of The Outlook for the Blind. And then, of course, it changed to become the Journal of Visual Impairment for the Blind. But it didn't necessarily have an emphasis on orientation and mobility. There were articles, from time to time that would deal with mobility, but there really weren't publications per se. I think the first publications that dealt directly with orientation and mobility were newsletter-like publications.
Long King.
Um, Western Michigan University and Boston College shared the Long Cane News, and it was a journal that would talk about specifics that would relate to orientation and mobility. And some of the really early great leaders would write articles and would have them in either of those two, um, in that journal that would be published by either of the two universities. And then when Florida State University came along, they started joking, well, maybe we should have a short cane news uh, because they were an undergraduate school. But that was about all we had were those publications. And I remember when I started teaching, and I was teaching at Cleveland State University in the early 70s, um, when we wanted to have materials for our students to read, we really didn't have very much material at all. And when we wanted to have our students learn various techniques of orientation and mobility, we had to have them write their own manuals. We'd give them the instruction. They would have to write down all of the details, and we would have to check their manuals to make sure that they were correct. And then in 1976, there was a publication um, that changed everything. Because up to this point in time, we had nothing in writing on the techniques themselves. And Butch Hill, Everett Hill, had decided that he would put together a book that would identify all the techniques that were needed in orientation and mobility. And leading up to that, we were all worried, to be honest, about what this might mean for the profession. There always have been individuals who would teach orientation and mobility who hadn't had a good background. And we thought, all right, this could be a real problem, that people without a background would pick up a book and would have these techniques and would try to put them into operation and would probably do more harm than good. And so people were really worried that this publication that Butch Hill and Ponder had put together would be a real problem. And then in 1976, it came out, and we were very pleased to see that it wasn't being used by people who were trying to become self-made orientation mobility specialists. And instead, it was being used by the universities, and each of the universities started requiring their students to buy this book. And in the process, it professionalized us. It kind of gave us a standardization, and it was really very, very helpful to us. Now, there had been some other books that had been written. Goodman had done some writing, and there had been others, but nothing as comprehensive as this. And from what I remember in talking with Butch about how he did this, he had a lot of his students who had been writing these manuals that we all had our students writing. And he had his students help him put together his first book. And Janet Barlow was one of those students. And so when Janet Barlow, when a time came when the book that Butch Hill had written with Purvis Ponder, it came to be that that book was somewhat obsolete. It really had been written before there were the new traffic regulations, um, and it seemed maybe to be misleading in some ways. That's it.
That's the book.
Orientation and mobility techniques. That's it. And so AFB asked, well, who do you think should write the next book? And recognizing that Janet had been so instrumental in helping with the first book, I thought she would be a great person to get involved in it. And so both she and Diane Fozzie wrote the next book, and that's really been enlarged and really has a lot more information in it. Hill and Ponder's book were basically an outline and really very, very helpful. But I think the new book that has a lot more information, gives us more of the why rather than just the how to do it. And so we had that specific in orientation and mobility. And then, of course, as time went on, we needed books in the universities. Beyond techniques, we needed books that dealt with theory about orientation and mobility. And it was Bruce Blosh and Rick Welsh that came up with the idea that instead of having students go out and read books from other disciplines, that what needed to be done was to have a book specifically about orientation and mobility. And so they put one together, and I wasn't an author. I was an author of part of it, but I wasn't an editor. And I watched how they put it together, though. And they would have to go outside to get people to help them because we didn't have writers within our field yet who had done enough writing. So, for example, on sensory awareness, they picked Herb Pick. And for other areas that were tangential, that were related to O&M but not specific, they chose authors that were not within our field. And then when that book was revised, by that point in time, enough time had gone by so that a lot of the professionals in our field had begun writing on their own. They'd begun submitting articles to to the New Outlook for the Blind at that point in time, and the Outlook for the Blind. And so they had become experienced writers. And so we were able to tap them. And so we shied away from going to people outside of our field, and we turned to the mobility specialists within the field to write the chapters.
And for the second edition, I remember the discussion of pairing people together with the hope and expectation of developing more authors within the field.
Yes, and so a lot of the early ones were kind of a conglomerate of a number of different people. To some extent, we still have a little bit of that, but more and more we have single authors as well.
Yeah.
So that's really how we put a lot of this together and how I think our publications evolved.
Yeah.
Now, AER also had its own publication. At one point, it was called Review, and it must have lasted 10 or 12 years, and then it ended. And about 5 years ago, we decided, well, we still need some kind of a publication that would be good for practitioners, because JVIB is great, but I'd say, the overwhelming majority of it is made up of articles that are really research articles. And a lot of people, I think, and sometimes me included, would read the abstracts and not read the entire article. And so we decided we wanted something that would be less researchy, so to speak, would contain research, but would be easier, I think, to relate to the actual practice of O&M and the practice in the other fields, in low vision, in vision rehabilitation therapy, etc. And so we came up with the idea that we needed a practitioner's journal, and that's where the new review came into being. And so we haven't published many issues, but we're on our fourth issue at this point now.
And you're on the fourth edition of the Foundations of Orientation and Mobility.
Yeah,
Bill
and I
happens
just so happen to have one right here. I don't know if we can get it to show.
So
There we
that
go.
That just came this past month.
Just this past month, it came out of EPH. At
Right.
one point in time, it was the American Foundation for the Blind that published all of our materials, and now APH does it. I think we're really lucky to have them do this for us, because when AFB gave up their publications, think of how we would be in really dire straits without having, professional books. And quite honestly, while they seem expensive, and they are expensive, they cost more to make than the organizations actually make from them. And I remember when I was on the board of AFB, that AFB's publications arm would always be in the red because the books, yeah, they brought in funding, but they could never cover everything. And so we're really lucky to have APH willing to produce these books for us. And I know they're really expensive, but they still, they don't print enough of them to be really profitable. And it's very expensive to put them together. So they do us a favor, really. They help our professions by producing them.
And I think one of the concerns is to have the younger people within the profession to do some more writing on techniques and strategies and put together articles. When I went through the program in 71, we got all our articles in ditto. I still have them,
Yeah.
by the way, but I kept them. And having the Long King News was like, oh my God, there's finally getting something that is, looks like a publication. And I don't think that people truly understand the importance of having your professional materials published as building towards a profession and getting professional recognition. So I thank you for all the editing that you have done and the work you have done with the foundation books.
And it makes me feel really good that a number of the articles that have come into the new review have been co-written by their professors and students together, so that our new students are really learning how to write and are doing a really good job.
Yeah.
And we're getting more and more really good writers in the field.
Right. And now they have a vehicle to submit with review, the new review, to submit those practical articles. So, and then there's been quite a bit of research, especially some of the research that like Beezy and Janet did with environmental access that has gotten some good publications. Okay, one of the other things that form a profession is the professional membership organization. And in the late 60s and early 70s, this was talked about a lot, of having an independent professional organization. So the states took it up. California, when I was in California, we had the California Association of Orientation Mobility. Illinois had it. New York had it. Then the SOMAs and the SOMAs started. What was the opposition to having a national independent orientation and mobility association that Bob LeDuc, you can talk about Bob LeDuc, really supported and pushed forward without getting any response from a lot of people?
Well, that's a really interesting question because, like you say, K-Ohms in California in 1966, NYSA Ohms in New York in 1970, Pittsburgh and a couple of years after that, they all had their own organizations, and they restricted membership to those individuals who were certified mobility specialists, even though the certification, didn't meet the standard of ACVREP, but it was certification. But they would restrict their membership to those individuals who had certification. But at the national level, AAWP called it an interest group. And it wasn't possible to restrict membership to an interest group to people who are certified. So it had to be open to everyone. And that still exists today. And it's even more of a problem today than it was back then. Because a number of years ago, AER, the successor to AAWB, decided that they would allow individuals to be members of, I think, up to 4 interest groups without having to pay extra for them. And so people now join much more than just their professional group. And so we have lots of people in Division 9 who are not orientation and mobility specialists. And it's a problem. It makes it less of a professional organization. Now,
Also, they can't govern themselves.
they can't really speak for the profession itself. It is a real problem. Now, like you say, Bob LeDuc, when I went to school, Bob was talking about, we need a professional organization. We should have our own organization. And he helped form NACOMA, the North, well, I forget what it stands for. But he didn't want to call it coma. He thought that may be a problem. So he called it NCOMA. But he said, he wanted to have some kind of a professional organization, but none of them ever really turned into a professional organization. Closest we could get, were SWOMA, NACOMA, all of the various regionals, because who would come to those? Only people who, actually were well-prepared instructors. And even later, when I chaired the Department of Blind Rehab, I would sit in the office with Bob, and Bob would tell me, we need a professional organization. But nobody ever took, the effort to produce one, to make one. And I don't think it was really until OMSA came into being that this ever happened. Can you tell us how OMSA came into being, Eileen?
Sure, I can tell you that. First of all, we realized that we had no governance at all within the division and that the people who, and I remember in the 70s, people joining the divisions because we had the best parties at the conferences. Sure. We had the most fun. The O&M division had the most fun and the best parties, and people wanted to be part of that. So they would join the division and come to all our parties and gatherings. I don't know that they were our business meetings were like very long and hard discussions at those conferences. They probably didn't participate in that. But when we were doing certification, the certification committee of the division had no authority to grant certification. It had to go to the board. And so people were granting our certifications and making standards, even with the university programs, who were not really representing the profession of O&M. And so, and then when we lost the governance of our own bylaws within the division and lost our own control of finances. I mean, when I was division chair, our secretary or treasurer was Diane Fossey, and we had our own checking account. I mean, we could write our own checks for what we wanted to support. And Donna did a great job with fundraising, and all that went into the division accounts. And when we had so much money and so support for that, and AER was going through some hard times, they took over the money because it wasn't necessarily a line item or anything we had the division had control over. And we sort of realized that was putting us at a disadvantage, being represented as a profession and being understood as a profession. And when you look at even the first foundations of orientation and mobility, when you and Rick define what a profession is, the one important thing is that they control and govern them. The profession sets up the standards and approves the standards themselves. The professionals do that. And we could not do that within the division. And so I'm trying to think of names. So Susan Langendorf and Mickey and Eileen Bischoff and myself, we met and we said, well, let's do it. Let's start it. And so Lucas joined us and Ed Bell joined us, and we initiated it, wrote the bylaws, incorporated, and started. And it's really gone well after, I guess, officially 6 years that we have over 200 members, but at least we have an identity nationally, and we have international members now of it being orientation mobility specialists.
All
So
I can say is hats off to you. I mean, you
yeah,
did a great job, and I just want to see it grow and grow.
yeah. And I hopefully it will. I think that people aren't into joining too much, but I think that if we can really promote that we're professionals and that we're not just an occupation that does this job, that maybe we could have more commitment to those pillars of what makes a profession, such as accreditation, certification, a code of ethics, and an independent membership organization. Are there any, before we have a few more questions, but our time is going. Are there any questions from those people who are here with us? Thank you very much. Any comment at all? Talk up. I see Bonnie. Oh, Joanne. Hi, Joanne. Nobody has a question.
There's a question in the chat, Eileen.
Oh,
Hi,
I
Bill.
can't.
Where is it?
Bonnie,
Come-
read the question in
Okay,
the
let me
chat
open it,
for
and
me.
read it to you. Yeah, it says, let's see here. This is from Judy Strauss Swartz to everyone. What about the RSA's involvement? They provided student funding for BC students. They called O&M parapathology. Was that because they wanted a more medical model? That's her question.
I don't know if it was because they wanted a more medical model, but you're right. RSA provided funding for both Boston College and Western Michigan University.
Mary Switzer.
Yes, and they called it parapathology, the art of traveling around. And I always liked that term. I kind of wish it had stuck. I like it better than orientation and mobility. The first person that I worked with was one of the early graduates from Boston College, Martha Ball Rosemeyer. And she used to talk about parapathology all the time. And I'm not sure that it had to do with the medical model, but it certainly had a more scientific name to it than orientation and mobility.
But it didn't stick. So
Did not
any
stick.
other questions? Okay. Now, Bill submitted a question. You wanna, which is, okay, so we didn't talk about O&M assistants or paraprofessionals.
Okay, when I entered the field, which was in the late 60s, there weren't many mobility specialists around. Jim Kimbrough at the Pittsburgh School for the Blind was training paraprofessionals. Others were training paraprofessionals. I was hired as a paraprofessional. I started out, I was told you will only do sensory training. And then gradually I began doing basic skill training. And then they taught me all the blindfold course instruction, the outdoor instruction. And I was working under Martha Rosemeyer and Kent Wardell. And when Martha left and there was no other instructor, they said, you will teach orientation mobility outside. So I went outside and I tried teaching mobility. I didn't know what I was doing. When my first client started crying after veering into the oncoming traffic, I thought to myself, I can't do this. I have to know what I'm doing. And I decided to go to school to learn what I was doing. But I saw people who were paraprofessionals who were trying to take on tasks without having the instruction that they needed. Yet there was a screaming need for help. There weren't enough mobility assistants. So we decided we needed some guidance. We didn't want people doing everything under the sun. We wanted to give them some guidance on what they should do, what they could do. And there was a need for instructors, people to help instructors, assistants. So in 1986, a committee was put together and we began looking at what should the role of an assistant be? And we contacted people across the country, mobility specialists, and they gave us ideas on what should be done. We put a paper together and we sent it to the division, and the division voted on it, and they said, yes, this is what we would like to have done. And it was a limited role. It did not include any outdoor travel. It included very minimal work, but it was work that would help in orientation, in concept development, in sensory awareness, that kind of thing, with a little bit of instruction in other areas, basic skills, for example. And at that point in time, Butch Hill and I put together a grant from the Office of RSA Office, Rehabilitation Services Administration. And we applied for funding to try to get a handle on what could be done as assistance. And they funded us. And we took the money and we developed training materials, training manuals. And the idea was train the trainers, that we would train orientation mobility specialists who would then train the trainers. And we would have these manuals that would teach them what they should do to train the assistants. And so we had a national conference. It was held in Kalamazoo. Butch and I hosted it. And then we went all around the country and we trained mobility specialists on how they would train assistants. And we were very optimistic that this would take off and would be helpful and would give them a limited role, but a role. And after a number of years, in 2004, we evaluated the program and we found out that after all of that work, only about 14 individuals were ever trained as assistants. And so we pretty much said, this isn't going to work. The train-the-trainer model will not work. So let's try something new. We put a new program together. And the new program was the universities would provide some basic academic work, but the techniques would be taught by schools and by agencies. And at this point in time, I was getting ready at WMU. I was chairperson. I was going to put courses into the curriculum for assistants. But I left to become a graduate dean there, and I never was able to put those courses in place. And other universities said they didn't have the bandwidth to do it. And so it just fell by the wayside and nothing ever happened. And that went on for just a number of years. And then all of a sudden, we start seeing again people who are teaching, and they don't have any guidance as to what they should teach. And there's no guidance, there's no document, there's nothing that tells them what to do. So most recently, we decided that we would again survey the field. We used the Delphi model, which basically is a way of getting to agreement among different groups as to what should be the role of a mobility assistant. And we came up with the idea that we don't think there will ever be an assistant that agencies and schools will hire as a position. It's too expensive, and for what they do, they don't do enough to really make a difference for that salary that they're commanding. And instead, agencies and schools, if they have the money, they want to hire a full-time, fully trained individual. However, one of the things that we discovered along the way, and Eileen and I had worked with ACVREP on a survey, and the survey came back to us, and the survey said, from practitioners who we surveyed, they said, no, this won't work. But they said there are paraeducators who could be trained, who already exist in some of the educational settings. And we should, if anything, they should be the ones who we might want to consider. So we now have a new position paper out. And it's a very limited role. It's all reinforcing, it's not teaching, but it gives guidance. And now if people are training these professionals and they're going way out about beyond the bounds of where they should, we can say, no, you're not practicing what the profession feels should be done. At the same time, we have a program, so to speak, that can be put into place for paraeducators, for the paras that are in schools already who are working with a lot of other students. They don't have to be hired specifically to be orientation and mobility assistants, but they can learn some of the skills, and they can reinforce some of the indoor skills, primarily indoor skills. And so that's what's come to happen. And it has just gone to the division for a vote. I know the outcome of the vote, but I won't say anything until they actually announce it publicly.
Okay. Any other questions, Bonnie, in the chat?
I'm looking.
This is
Okay, good.
excellent. There's no questions.
No other questions. Nope.
Okay, the one thing that we need to touch on is the first certification exam for O&M. We were at a meeting in Washington, D.C. We were talking about third-party reimbursement and licensure. And as George Zimmerman was walking out of the meeting, he said, "We will never be accepted as to be third-party reimbursed or even licensures within the state until we have a certification that is recognized as an independent of the membership organization, and we have a certification exam." So that sort of set us off on working on the certification exam. Bill, why don't you share some of the initial?
Okay, well, I remember sitting around with you at different meetings, and you would always say, look at the OTs. They have a certification body. It is independent of the professional organization. It gives them credibility. It legitimizes what they do. That's what we need. And really, I credit you with pushing that idea to the point that ACVREP was founded. And the division eventually came up with the idea as well. They accepted it, and they appointed a committee to begin looking at this. And remember how we began exploring this. We went to CRCC, which is the Certification of Rehabilitation Counselors. And I had been a CRCC at that point, or a CRC at that point myself. And I remember that they had an independent certifying body. And we decided we would go and we would talk to them. We'd find out exactly what they did and how they did it. And you and I, Eileen, went and we talked to them. And we learned about how they put this together. Go ahead.
Yes, and we also learned that Don Blosh had come and talked to them earlier about possibly joining them as with our certification for O&M, which I didn't know before we talked to that lady, but that was really good. But she gave us a lot of really important information as far and context regarding development of the job description. So we could move from there to a job analysis. So we could move from there to a blueprint. So talk about
as I remember, we did an analysis of the job itself so that we could verify that the components of that job, what they were, that they really did exist, and that what was required of the instructor was really coming from the job itself. It wasn't something that was made up, it was in the job. So we did that job analysis, and then we decided that we would have a question or a test. It would have about 200 questions to it. And we held meetings in different locations, and we called in mobility specialists, and we did writing seminars, and we put together a test of about 200 questions. And then when ACVREP took over all of this and came into existence, then it really became professionalized, and they really had a company that came in. I remember rewriting that exam and all of the discussions and questions we had, and really a lot of arguments as to what should be included in that exam.
Yeah.
And of course,
I bet they're still arguing about it.
I bet they're still arguing about it.
But one of the things too that we met at Western Michigan to the writing seminars, and then we met at Atlanta, and Bill DeLong did a beta test because we had did a beta test where we had 100 O&M specialists do the test, 100 vision specialists who were not O&M do the test, and 100 non-vision professionals, but who had a bachelor's degree, do the test. And Bill put all that data together for the beta test to come up with what a score should be. So, thanks to Bill DeLong for his contribution. And he also did that for the low vision test. A lot of volunteer work, Okay. Well, I know you have one last question that you keep wanting to ask or talk about. is why did you always involve Eileen Sifferman in most of your major projects? Go
Yeah,
ahead.
that was a question that I asked to have you ask me. You have been instrumental all the way through with your ideas. You always talked about certification and how important it was. You always talked about the fact that we needed to review the universities. You were involved in, I think, every stage of this. And I always appreciated your keen memory and your ability to logically think things through. And so I have always been very appreciative of all the work you've done. You've made a major contribution to how this profession really has evolved. Thank you.
Thank you. And I still have some more ideas, Kathy. So
I bet you do.
we have to keep working them. Kathy Zeiger is on this conference call. So I tell her all the time that we need to do this, we need to do that. And of course, she said, go ahead and do it, but I can't always do it myself. So we need to keep working to improve the profession and know what we want to be. If we want to be professionals and if we want to be recognized as a profession, we need to really work to support accreditation. We need to get all of our universities accredited. We need to get all the people who go through our O&M programs certified. And we need to make sure we have a strong code of ethics and that we one of the things that I mentioned to Kathy, I think a requirement for recertification should be that we have so many required hours in ethics. So we need to start keep stepping up to the plate to become better, so we can be better recognized as a profession.
And in closing, if I can just say this, that we've come a long way. We came from program review to really now a full-fledged accreditation of the universities. And most professions, when they get to that point where they have accreditation of the universities, they require that in order to sit for the certification examination that you have graduated from a university that is accredited. And I would hope the next step in certification would be that this becomes part of the requirement for certification.
And that is a requirement for OTs, it's a requirement for audiology, it's a requirement for speech and language. So, if you want to be considered first class certified, then we have to require those standards that the first class certifications require. Okay, Leslie, were you going to close us out here?
Yes, thank you very much. This is Leslie. Thank you, Bill and Eileen. This was fantastic and so interesting. I learned so many things. I especially loved the story about how we got to inviting people who are blind or low vision to join the profession as well, and really incorporating that. I found that incredibly fascinating, along with everything else. But thank you, thank you, thank you. So for all of your time to the profession and your dedication, we couldn't be where we are without both of you. So thank you. And thank you for sharing it with us tonight. And thank you to everybody who joined. We look forward to our next Mobility Monday in January. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.